Futurama comic, issue 47. Fry throws a knife at Bender when Bender's stuck to a spinning wheel for some reason. He wonders if Bender's okay, and he says he got rid of his headache somehow, and says he should become an acupuncturist or a butcher, which are Fry's two dreams. Hubert says the professor's been calling for them. Farnsworth says they're gonna go to Germany to show off his latest invention at the Berlin Air and Space Show. He shows the crew a spaceship that can drive. It's too bad it looks so goofy. He doesn't have an answer for why he built this, and says that it also floats in the ocean. And he expects them to use an oar to paddle it to Germany, even though that'd take forever, because apparently if he makes them suffer, it'll be worth it. Lilo says a month at sea might be bad for his invention. Well, if it's in the cargo hold of the ship like I expected, it'd go to Germany in 5 minutes. After he's rude again, he admits that she's right. Hubert says he won't go to Germany because he thinks conventions and trade shows are time wasters, and reminds Bender that he can make beer in his body. He's right. Farnsworth gets to the show, and the only promoter there to speak to is Wernstrom. He tells Wernstrom he can have his student intern if he lets him display his new invention. Then he plans on having Hermes get sent to him wearing a pink sweatsuit and posing hilariously. He shows off his invention driving, and Wernstrom's all confused about seeing wheels, as if he's never heard of less advanced civilizations still using wheels on other planets. I guess the idea is, we're supposed to believe that every single alien civilization that's so unadvanced that they still use wheels has not had contact with other alien planets yet, because they assume that it would be too much of a shock to them. You'd think some of those planets would still be invaded by more advanced ones that don't care, though. Everyone laughs at Farnsworth, and a week later, he hasn't come out of his room for days, even though he usually doesn't care what people think. And all because he went to a space and air show with something that can't fly, which no one would do. Amy says she has an extra ticket to the lingerie modeling show. Farnsworth calls over Bender and says he's not going to make him kill all humans, just something simpler. Bender tells his crew that it's all going to be very discreet so it looks like an accident for the insurance, and says he always wanted to be a walking bomb. Hubert reminds him that he already is, and I wonder how that bomb could still be in him, because Farnsworth would have removed it to keep it for himself. Not to mention there were 2 different comic issues before this where Bender went to different bodies, but sadly the comic doesn't have continuity, so that doesn't matter. But still, he would have sent him into a different body instead of keeping him in a body with a bomb in it, and extracted that bomb for himself. Farnsworth leaves the room, hearing all the commotion, and reassures them, and then tells Bender to meet him in the Doomsday Parlor. As I wonder why the writer is making fun of fans that are smarter and more observant than him. If he knows that it doesn't make sense because Bender has a bomb in him already, why is he writing like that? Why isn't he explaining why that bomb isn't still in him? Bender says he'll bring the insurance papers, which I assume are in his chest compartment. Farnsworth wants to install something, and then it gets sent out of the window flying in a puff of smoke because of the professor, who apparently was too stupid in all his years to think that he could just make a memory erasing device so he wouldn't have to be humiliated by what he went through anymore. He flies past the mayor into a TV screen above the city and is somehow able to control his flight to come back to the women's dressing room. Hubert gets worried, revealing that he cares about Farnsworth and thinks he poisoned himself. But he wakes up and says he didn't get to drink it because of his narcolepsy. Wouldn't he have cured its narcolepsy? He falls asleep instead of telling them where Bender went. Bender realizes he can fly now because of an invention and falls into the road, but is well built enough to be totally undamaged. And he can't fly under the radar in protected airspace, which he should have expected. He needs something to avoid detection when airborne, and gets a giant bird costume that still shows his face from under the beak because that was all he had in the store. Farnsworth wakes up in restraints and tells them to let him out, but somehow expects them to do that even though he's threatening to kill them. Fry somehow tries to humor him, and Leela has to stop him. Then Bender comes back and says he installed something that was supposed to blow them both up, but somehow lets him fly instead. It makes sense that he wanted to blow up Bender too, because Bender's a criminal, so he wouldn't be able to break the law anymore. He thought he was going to do one last good thing, as well as get back at Bender. Bender tells Fry that he can look in people's windows and drop stuff from above. Leela calls him out a little, and he offers to fly with Fry and says he's always wanted to have a superpower. Again, why does the writer make a mistake if he's aware of that mistake? Because it's clearly not funny. If the writer knows he used to have superpowers, why did he write Bender to say he always wanted to have one? Why try to make fun of Cubert? It's only the writer who's being made a fool out of. Bender flies over the ocean. Fry slips off him and he catches him. So people assume he's a superhero for saving Fry. At least Bender admits he's not a hero, but he still agrees to save someone's cat from a tree. The woman he got the cat for isn't someone who should have a cat, but she still thanks him. Then Bender's told there's a fire on the orphan factory, and Bender says if he had known he would have had to save Tinny Tim, he wouldn't have started this fire. Why admit you started it? Doesn't he want to keep this up for the glory? Why did he even start the fire? We see this get reported on, and Leela lampshades that she thought he liked multimedia attention. And Bender says he doesn't want it for doing good deeds because he has a reputation to protect. A better response would be that he doesn't deserve hero worship. Farnsworth says he's patented his flying robot plans, which gave him a new lease on life, so he wants to show off Bender at the air show. Bender refuses and storms off and says he's gonna wander around a bad neighborhood. He wastes his time in a confessional as I wonder why, if he didn't want to be known for doing good things, he did them in public anyways, when it's normally not in character for him to bother. The robot minister tells Bender that the answer's inside of him, which is just a subtle way of saying, I don't know, maybe you know. At least be honest. Bender put the propulsion system in Tinny Tim instead, and surprisingly, the story ends with them exploding while Bender didn't. And Farnsworth is still happy with Bender's hand on his shoulder because Bender was able to do this, even though he wanted to show him off as a flying robot and now he can't do that. Wouldn't he just get depressed again? Futurama comic. Issue 48. Fry tries to play Operation, and there's a depressing gag where it turns out the Operation guy is an alien who passed out after his impossibly stupid drinking contest with a robot. Zoidberg angsts, and Fry tells him he's not as bad off as his uncle Zoid, who's holding a sign saying he'll crack nuts for food. Well, his new movie opens tomorrow, it got trashed in early reviews from the psychic press. Zoidberg gets told that his parents never wanted him to be a doctor. They were immigrants who never learned the right word for lawyer, even though that'd take a second to Google. They just wanted to be a lawyer, and somehow doctor was the word they used instead. After all the time they spent in that country, somehow Zoid's parents got the words women and tuna sandwich confused as well. Zoidberg trades his doctor's license over Amy's computer for a law degree, and he wonders if this is legal. It couldn't be, so he'd know that. Fry has a cringe-worthy moment where he loses his teeth in peanut brittle, and when Zoidberg says Dr. Zoidberg is dead, Hermes tries to shoot him saying he's a zombie, because he just wants an excuse to do that. Fry wonders where he'll find a doctor he can afford with no health insurance. Instead of going to an alien planet instead of his awful Earth, he somehow trusts Bender, who does the stupid thing and says that according to the first thing he found online, Fry's got scurvy, thinks he's doomed, and Bender doesn't care and needs to make a delivery to Washington, D.C. Zoidberg must be recognized by the 3 people who got into car accidents, because logically they would want a lawyer. But if they know how incompetent he is, then they wouldn't want him as a lawyer. Miraculously, none of them are noticeably injured, and they all drive on the road on wheels, when Farnsworth was mocked for using wheels in an earlier story. Wordstrom acted like he never saw wheels before, so this must be in a different universe. It does make sense that cars would still exist as a cheaper alternative. Zoidberg wants to give up. Leela's parents say they thought her flowers were wonderful, but because they smelled too nice, they somehow short-circuited their neighbor's brain, so he's paralyzed and is suing them. And somehow there aren't any lawyers in the sewers despite them having a whole civilization down there, so they might lose the house. I really hate this kind of plot point where a character does something good for the parents and it horribly backfires on them. Zoidberg's called handsome by Leela's mom and is told to clean her video screen. If it was that dirty, she'd have done it a while ago. She was just being nice. Or beauty standards are different for mutants. Predictably, Zoidberg takes the case. Fry's mad at how expensive fruits and vegetables are and storms out saying he'll grow his own. For some reason, a guy comes out of the alley just then saying that he heard he needs some seeds. He says he'll trade him magic beans for a cow, and another guy beside him offers him a cow to buy. So he sees Zoidberg at the trial already. If there aren't any lawyers in the sewers, I suppose the courts wouldn't be so backed up that it'd take months to get to any trial. They could still Google Zoidberg in a second and find out that he's not a real lawyer. The guy suing gets to say what he's accusing Leela's parents of instead of a prosecutor getting to do that. And in fact, I don't even think there are any prosecutors here. And Zoidberg accidentally cuts off his nose with his claw and apologizes. Then despite the guy screaming, the judge assumes that his nose was fake, which means he didn't actually smell anything. But if it was fake, why wasn't he in enough pain to jump out of his wheelchair and instinctively scream? But he did prove he wasn't paralyzed. So Leela's parents get out of trouble, and Zoidberg doesn't get in trouble for injuring someone. Zoidberg's asked out to dinner as Leela's mom hugs him. Meanwhile, Fry plants the beans and hopes for a beanstalk. He falls asleep after inexplicably deciding to wait in front of them doing nothing, and somehow the plant looks like him. That is a magic bean. Zoidberg somehow thinks his friends would want flushed mutant food. How would the mutants' non-mutant ancestors survive having to only eat this stuff? Leela thanks Zoidberg, and Bender's desperate enough to want Zoidberg for a lawyer because the federal government arrested him for treason in Washington and somehow no lawyer will represent him, even though one would be appointed to him regardless. I wonder how he'll magically get off scot-free, even though this comic doesn't have continuity to require that. And the beanstalk really is magical because he talks about sports rules, which you wouldn't know about. This bores Fry into leaving, and he releases reproduction spores. Bender reveals that he's somehow gotten away with not paying taxes in all this time, and he got in trouble for stealing secret government documents from the White House. Nixon secretly videotapes anyone who visits them in the office, including Zod, who he likes. This worked out because he got footage of what Bender did. Bender's so upset at being imprisoned that he says theirs was, and he lies that he doesn't remember stealing the tapes, but if he's found guilty, they'll recycle his parts into a playground set for orphans. Why did he get arrested for this but not everything else he's done? Then Fry sees plants looking like his friends. At least it's doing something original with the magic beans instead of just ripping off Jack and the Beanstalk. Leela's got slightly more interesting trivia because she says the origin of polka music. Fry says they're also dull, but there's also the problem that he can't follow all of their dialogue at once. Farnsworth shows up and tells him to follow him to the safe room because if the world is doomed, he wants to die close to the safe money. Somehow I'm supposed to buy that going green was just a fad, and not the constant way of the future from now on that's actually going to go on to be less expensive and better to get energy from eventually. He explains that his ancestor created a soybean plant you could attach to your head and broadcast podcasts into your mind, but the bond affected the plants as well, and they magically evolved to resemble their owners and obsessively recite trivia. Why would their trivia come from podcasts? It sounds like it came from Wikipedia. Podcasts are about people having a conversation, not this. People who once loved podcasts were being somehow bored to death. They could have just destroyed the plants. So the world's governments gathered all the podcast people and blasted them into space, instead of doing so to the plants. Oh, never mind, the plants were the ones sent into space. I thought podcast people meant people making podcasts. They go to various planets, decimating them with their crazy ramblings, which are probably not something they have control over, because that's not advantageous to their survival at all. Farnsworth wants to be lethally locked in a safe instead of using his ability to invent impossible things to easily save the world, like sending an army of flying flybots to destroy all of the podcast plants. Somehow, there's a judge that immediately declares Bender guilty. That'd definitely get him fired. That'd be a mistrial. Instead, there's just an objection, and Nixon was allowed to say it, and he wants this trial to be slow and painful for Bender, who thinks it's funny that Nixon almost has Milhouse as his middle name. I hope that's true. The prosecutor is the chicken guy again. Zoidberg objects to what he says about the videotapes because video evidence can easily be faked. Well, it is the future, but still. What he should say is that there's multiple Bender units. It doesn't necessarily have to be Bender himself who did it. Then he shows them footage of Bender stealing candy from kids. He stupidly admits that the footage was real, which just brings in bad character evidence against him and taints the judge and jury. This has nothing to do with the crime he's accused of. He says to just imagine if it was fake. The only defense would be that the video could have been faked. It could have been out of context, showing him at a different time period than is being claimed. But it's very unlikely. And again, it could have been a different Bender unit for all they know. Which really goes to show how unlikely it is that there would be tons of different models of robots that look exactly the same if they're all sentient and citizens. Because they would accidentally frame each other for crimes. Zoidberg asks Nixon to testify about how Bender, a simple bending robot, broke into the White House. Nixon says his vice president is in charge of guarding the office, but lately he's been hooked on his new online video game and let a Pinko robot get in during a routine delivery. I always have to assume Agnew's got a CPU to be alive without a head. And he's not able to talk because then he'd annoy Nixon. I don't know why people would put up with that though. Zoidberg wastes time saying that Bender wants to do a violent act like breaking and entering because he's a good robot. That won't be considered a good defense. They're not arguing over how his general character is, just over whether he did or not. Then Bender snaps from stress and bends the judge's desk, saying he'll kill them all. But to be fair, there was no way he was getting off in this trial anyways, so this would be his only chance of escape. It turns out the plants say trivia about nouns that the people around them mention. And Farnsworth says trivia about herbicide, which does nothing to them, magically, because they don't feed on carbon dioxide, but attention, magically. Fry says that now he'll never be able to read the complete collection of Green Lantern comics. He says boring stuff about Green Lantern, and the plants choke and start dying as Leela wants them to keep telling her details about it. But it doesn't make any sense because every subject has a ton to talk about, not just comic franchises. What makes comic franchises more boring than all the other stuff that was mentioned? It seems like the writer's bias is showing. It cuts past the trial, thankfully, because that was a disaster. Bender's body was taken away, and he lies that he can't remember a thing. I wonder if the twist is going to be that he's not lying about his memory loss, and he's really being remote controlled into causing trouble, because that'd get him off. The prosecutor tells Zoidberg that he doesn't know how this game is played. Then there's another trial, somehow with the same judge in bandages. That's making me smile from how ridiculous and shocking it is. Zoidberg gets told to make his closing argument and thanks the judge. Then Bender's head tries to attack Nixon, somehow being able to move. And Agnew does nothing. I wonder if Agnew's controlling him. Bender gets asked why he attacked Nixon and says he doesn't remember. Zoidberg says he'd like to call the vice president to give new evidence. The prosecutor says that they're in closing arguments. Yeah, so it'd be considered too late. They'd have to do this on an appeal trial. Zoidberg says Agnew doesn't have to speak, just go back to playing his video game, which causes Bender to attack Nixon again. Zoidberg tells the judge he's going to enter the game system into evidence, which has a Wi-Fi connection on the same frequency as Bender's antenna, and he wouldn't be allowed to suddenly enter a new thing into evidence. And as much as people love seeing this for plot convenience, he wouldn't be allowed to suddenly enter a new thing into evidence. All of the evidence would have to be there from the start after being found in Discovery. He'd have to wait until another trial to use the evidence, but this is entertaining to watch. I guess trials are done more conveniently in the future. Zoidberg gets asked why a game would make a robot raid the White House, and he says the name of the game is White House Raider. So Bender was making a delivery of flag fresheners when he got brainwashed. The judge immediately believes him and proclaims Bender innocent, even though he hates Bender himself, and could have just as easily said Bender was lying and jumping at the chance to attack Nixon when he thought he could get away with it. So Bender gets his body back, and Zoidberg says that the reason he knew what he did is that the rooster said he didn't know how the game was played. That realistically didn't make him think of Agnew's video game. It made him realize he was right that he's a terrible lawyer. He hasn't even studied law yet. At least give it a chance first. If he's a worse lawyer than a doctor, then why is it that he won every case? And almost always gets shown to be a terrible doctor. He says that he traded his degrees back to that guy online and then hired him to tell him what to do. And that guy was being a doctor and had a good reason to be desperate to give it up. Fry tells Bender he saved the world, and Bender congratulates him that he knew he had it in him to bore people to death. How did those plants be capable of being bored to death? How could anyone? Too bad there's a downer ending where Zoidberg sucks at helping Fry. He makes him a half sheep with the wrong shot. If there's a needle that can make him half sheep, there'd be a way to return him to normal right away too. Farnsworth can make anything, and mastered cloning technology, and body switching. Instead, the story ends with nobody feeling sorry for Fry somehow, and Zoid just making a joke about it. This story was about Farnsworth somehow deciding to show off an invention that can't fly at an air show. So after he's humiliated, he decides to try to get Bender to explode on him. Bender should have known immediately that he'd be blown up too. Somehow he wasn't and agreed to that, and instead became able to fly. He saves Fry when he falls off him and gets known as a superhero. And even though he didn't want to be known as one, he still saves some people from a fire, despite the new Justice Team having to be fine with being known as a hero. So no wonder him being opposed to it made no sense. He gets upset and eventually goes to a robot minister for advice, and he tells him the answer to what he should do is inside him, rather than keeping it simple and just telling him to do good. So he installs the jet propulsion in Tinny Tim, and Farnsworth is proud of him, and is still happy when Tinny explodes. I liked that Bender did something good in this story, and Kubert proved that he cares about Farnsworth after all. And so does the rest of the crew, despite everything he put them through. I would think that a replacement boss would pay them better and treat them better. This story had Zoidberg finally give up being a doctor for a predictably temporary status quo change. Ironically, he ends up winning every case from sheer luck. With the first trial, you'd think he would have gotten in trouble for injuring someone, and the second trial was complete nonsense, really taking advantage of artistic license law. He only became a lawyer because his parents somehow said doctor instead of lawyer when they wanted to let him know what they wanted him to do. Eventually, Zoidberg quits being a lawyer because he knows he has no idea what he's doing, after proving that Bender wasn't guilty, and was just being remote controlled. I assume that he thinks studying to be an actual lawyer would be too hard work. So that's why he gets his phony doctor degree back. It has to be phony to explain how insanely bad he is at it. The story didn't have the time to show him trying and failing a third case, because it wasted so much time on a plot where Fry got bored by trivia from magic plants, which somehow had a pseudo-scientific backstory when they could have saved his comic space by simply saying a wizard made them. How would podcasts make them obsessed with reciting Wikipedia articles? And somehow Fry can bore them all to death talking about Green Lantern. If they're all about magically boring people to death, I'd expect them to be immune to that and find every subject interesting. With the rules established earlier, I thought they would start talking about Green Lantern themselves, because they start reciting trivia on whatever they're talked to about. The subplot with Fry should have been shortened. It could have started having the plants talk when Leela got back to Fry and had him bore them to death a lot faster. At least it wasn't just like Jack and the Beanstalk and instead tried to do something creative.